Okay, this is Block 11, Reagan's Revolution, Part 3, Reagan at Home, with the section Economic Growth. When Reagan took office, interest rates and inflation were high. And Reagan had run on an Austrian/supply-side solution to the economic problems. He promised to cut taxes for everybody in the United States, and he claimed, and here's a famous line, government was not the solution to the problem, government is the problem. That government and regulations and red tape were getting in people's way, that they could not live their lives, run their businesses as they otherwise would, and grow the economy. So Reagan cut tax rates for individuals. The top rate went from 70% to 40%, and cut taxes for everybody else as well. Cut taxes for businesses, lowered real estate taxes, created tax-free savings plan in a Austrian attempt to stimulate the economy, to stimulate the supply side of the economy, not the demand side of the economy. This supply-side Austrian economics is also sometimes called trickle-down economics. And what trickle-down economics says is if you cut taxes on high earners, now you cut taxes for everybody, but you cut taxes more for people making more because they were paying a higher rate to begin with. Plus, they're getting a larger tax cut because their income is larger. So if you trickle-down economics, Austrian economics, supply-side economics, whatever you want to call it, says if you cut taxes for these high earners, if you cut taxes for businesses, if you cut corporate taxes, they would both spend more money stimulating the economy, they would invest more money stimulating the economy, they would grow their businesses more stimulating the economy, and all of that economic activity done by the people at the top would trickle down to lower income people. We have seen that this economic activity, even though tax rates were lower, would actually create more tax revenue, and we can see in Reagan's term in office, this bottom number is the amount of federal revenue that the government took in. Despite the lower taxes, revenue did go up from $599 billion in 1981 to when Reagan left office, it was almost 60 to 70% more than that. So the amount of tax money that the United States Treasury was taking in did go up on a regular basis throughout the 1980s. The other thing that Reagan wanted to do was slash government spending. But he was much less successful in doing that. Now, although Reagan had won the election, the House of Representatives was still in Democratic hands, and Reagan was going to have to compromise to get what he wanted. Reagan's first budget proposed cuts of $35 billion, which was about 10% of, about 8% of federal outlays. But he actually, in reality, got a lot less than that. That the deal that he made with the Democratic leadership in the House was Reagan would get his tax cuts, but he was not going to be able to slash government spending as much as he wanted to. So not cutting the budget was the deal he had to make to get his tax cuts through a Democratic House. So you have lower taxes. Government spending remains almost the same. He got a couple cuts through, but not really as much as he wanted, and not as much as conservatives wanted. He ordered anti-inflationary tight money policies that had been begun by President Carter. He continued President Carter's tight money policies in order to lower inflation. He was willing to put up with higher interest rates to kind of tame inflation finally. And if you remember that inflation had been kind of battering the U.S. economy ever since the late 1960s. In 1981 and 1982, the U.S. suffered through a terrible recession. And a lot of people started to say that Reaganomics, Reagan's economic policies, supply-side economics, Austrian economics are an utter failure. And that Reagan and the newfangled conservatives in Washington would be thrown out in the 1984 election. And the press, who hated Reagan the same way they hated Nixon, celebrated. The press, as we're going to see more in a Cold War aspect, the press thought Reagan was an idiot, to be perfectly frank, and they thought that he was merely parroting lines from extremist conservatives, kind of off stage, and with his smiley manner he had fooled the American people into voting for these economic policies that they believed hurt them. The press believed that his economic policies hurt ordinary Americans. But Reagan stayed the course. By the summer of 1982, the economy had begun to grow. And by the beginning of 1983, the American economy began to take off. And then it continued to grow and grow and grow and grow. And you can see that how much the economy grew because how much the tax revenues were going up despite tax rates being lower. That this proves, you know, a lot of people would argue that Art Laffer was right, that if you lower tax revenues, you will stimulate growth, and then the government will take in more revenues to begin with. That through the decade of the 1980s, growth was at least 4% a year, and often it was much higher. The economy grew continually for 10 years until 1991-1992, when it suffered a small recession. Due to that recession, as we'll see in Block 12, Bill Clinton became president, but Bill Clinton was a moderate Democrat. He was a centrist Democrat in a lot of ways. And he kept Ronald Reagan's economic policies pretty much the same. And then you had pretty much straight growth from 1992 to 2007. So under Reagan's economic policies, you had pretty much continual growth with one recessionary exception from 1982 to 2007. That's almost an entire generation of Americans who grew up knowing nothing but economic growth and economic success. So we are forced to ask the question, was Reaganomics, was Ronald Reagan's economic policies the reason for this growth? There's mixed evidence. In favor of Reagan's economics was the fact that under Reagan's basic structure, you had 25 years of growth. You know, it's hard to argue with success. You know, there was 25 years of growth, you know, after there had been, you know, 15 years of stagnation, or 10 years, yeah, almost 15 years of stagnation. In opposition to the argument that Reagan's economic policies were the reason for this economic growth was a couple reasons. Number one, a lot of the growth was due to military spending, that Reagan increased the defense budget by a lot of money in the 1980s. Some of the growth was due to lower oil prices. Reagan kind of made a deal with the Saudis. The Saudis didn't like the Soviet Union as much as Reagan didn't like the Soviet Union. And we can talk about this now because it relates. The Soviet Union has a lot of oil in it, and the Soviet Union sold its oil to make desperately needed hard currency, dollars and other hard currencies. And when the price of oil was high, that helped the Soviet economy because they could export their oil. Reagan made a deal with the Saudis to increase the supply of oil, which would lower the price of oil, which would hurt the Soviet economy. So oil, under Reagan's watch, he kind of had a deal with the Soviets where oil became a lot cheaper, which hurt the Soviet economy. So just cheaper fuel, cheaper energy helps the American economy, of course. The third reason that, you know, this was not Ronald Reagan's doing particularly, but the computer revolution started sweeping American businesses in the 1980s, which increased productivity. That people could do more work in less time with the aid of computers, and that's obviously going to create economic growth. Conservatives have responses to all three. You know, they'll say specifically that it was Reagan's cutting of taxes and regulations that allowed the computer industry to flourish in the first place. You know, conservatives have counter-arguments, and then Keynesian liberal economics have counter-arguments to the counter-arguments, and so on and so on. But regardless, that the growth in the U.S. economy was real in the 1980s. It was not even, as we're going to see, but it was real for everybody, that everyone's standard of living, except those at the very bottom, went up during Reagan's years in the White House.